Darian Fenton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's a pleasure to take a call in the second reading of the Student Loan Scheme Bill. And as my colleagues have said, we support this bill, albeit with some reservations. It's been very interesting listening to the debate, and I think the committee stages are going to be very interesting. There's certainly a couple of questions that we want to have addressed. And it's also been interesting listening to people reminisce about their university days. And of course I come from a generation where we didn't have student loans and student fees, and I wasn't the best of students actually. I studied in the 70s when it was quite fashionable to drop out, and I hate to admit the fact that taxpayers paid for me to go to university and I didn't complete the study, although I did go on later on with my colleague Sue Moroney and do trade union and labour studies. I didn't need a student loan for that because my union paid for me to do that study, so I didn't need a student loan, so I've never had to experience a student loan. And I'm very grateful to four generations for allowing me to do this study that I don't think was completely wasted, but also to complete study later on. However, my son has experienced a student loan. He's just returned from San Francisco this week on a temporary visit, and so he'll be very interested in how much easier it will be for him to be able to communicate with the IRD and make his repayments. Of course, one of the things we hope with this bill and these changes that it will make it easier, or more likely that some of the people that are overseas, some of the former students that are overseas, will be able to repay their debt and come home to New Zealand, bring their skills back to New Zealand. Unfortunately, I think there's an awful lot more to it than just student loans that are keeping our best and brightest overseas. Mr. Speaker, I think it's often, we know it's to do with the low wages in New Zealand and the fact that we have a huge gap between here and Australia, for example, and opportunities for jobs are so much better in many other countries. The purpose of this bill is to amend the student loan administration system to an electronic format, and that seems very sensible. And the purpose is to make it easier for borrowers to communicate with the IRD wherever they are. I think, as the Green member said, it does seem interesting that it's taken a while for the IRD to get this onto an electronic system. I understand that the student loan scheme, as it is currently administered, is actually pretty unwieldy. It's expensive to maintain, and it has had limited ability to accommodate further changes. So this is a good thing to see this moving to the modern era, see IRD being able to move student loans to a system where it makes it much easier for the students who have borrowed money. And the repayment method is also being simplified to avoid the end-of-year square-ups for most borrowers, and late repayment penalties are being simplified and eased. Now, as I've said already, that Labor supports this bill, as we do believe it will improve debt repayment. It's a major factor driving graduates overseas, and as I said already, it's one reason they don't come home, but we want them to come home and bring their skills back. So if this helps, we welcome that. However, we do have a couple of concerns which will be outlined in my contribution, but also in the committee stages. The student loan debt held by overseas graduates is a real problem, and it's something that we do have to address. So to this end, we particularly support the changes in the bill to late payment penalties from a total 19.56 interest a year to just 10.6%, or 8.6% if the student enters into instalment arrangements. But the Treasury expects these changes to increase student loan receipts by up to $22 million a year by 2014. That's a positive step forward. But we do have to ask, why then do we need to have an increase in the student loan establishment fee from $50 to $60? And as other speakers have said, this is an attempt to introduce interest by stealth. It seems completely unnecessary. It seems completely unnecessary when this bill will actually improve the repayments. And we need to understand, and we will be asking questions about why this is necessary, why the government thinks that they have to reintroduce interest by stealth. what it will do, Mr Speaker, is add an extra financial burden on those who are already struggling to pay their bills and who have incurred substantial debts as a result of their studying. And similarly, another concern we have is that it appears unfair that a borrower who, due to the new pay period deduction system, unintentionally makes accessory payments of over $500 in a year is not able to apply for the 10% accessory payment bonus at the end of the year. So it appears that the government hasn't really fully thought out the impacts of this simplification plan, and perhaps a simpler and fairer way of dealing with it is to say that no student has to repay debt while participating in full-time study. So this bill does take a positive approach to managing student loan debt, but I do have to say, Mr Speaker, there will be tens of thousands of students to whom this bill doesn't apply, and I can't help but reflect on that in my contribution. At a time when we should be investing in tertiary education for all, of course we're seeing caps and cuts and dampening of demand for all tertiary education.
All we're seeing is food stamps.
And we're seeing is food stamps. That's all we're seeing. Yes, that's right. But I'm also very, very concerned about the exclusion of 55-year-olds from loan access. Sends a message to older people that there's no point in them reskilling. There's no point in adult education. It does, of course, not apply in this bill. These people are excluded from this bill, and that makes this whole policy pretty questionable. And the policy of excluding over 55-year-olds is, I think, very short-sighted, punitive and harsh. We are in a country where we have an ageing workforce. The workforce, we're told repeatedly that people will have to change their jobs many times during their lifetime. They will have to reskill as things change. We know that the jobs that we are training our younger students to do today do not yet exist. Yet here we are saying to older people, sorry, you're on the scrap heap, you're not worthy of adult education, and I think that's really, really unfair. We're also concerned, Mr Speaker, about the removal of the fee maxima, and that's not in this bill, of course, but that is not in this bill, of course, but it is one of the things that we're very concerned about in a replacement with an annual fee movement. So the National Party can go on and on about the delights of this bill, and I really loved David Bennett's contribution, who was talking...
I missed it.
Oh, did you? You missed it, which was all about what a wonderful job this government is doing on student loans and how students all around the country will be thanking this government and be very, very grateful to them. They're not grateful, actually. They're very, very concerned about some of the policies of this government and the things that they're doing, like the removal of the fee maxima. So, Mr Speaker, as I said at the beginning, Labor does support this bill. We have some concerns about a couple of questions which we will be asking during the committee stages. Finally, just a final word to Sir Roger Douglas. His contributions on these things are always eminently predictable. It's a long time since he represented the people of Otara, and actually the people of Otara want their children to study, and they want them to do well, and they're as entitled as anybody else in the country to have decent study and affordable study. And you go and talk to any of the Pacific families in Otara and you'll find that out, Sir Roger, that they are ambitious for their children. They do not deserve to be treated or talked about in any different way to anybody else in this country. They are our future, and we need to look after them.
Very good.
Aaron Gilmore.